everyone. Welcome to the Arts Club at Home. We are delighted that Merrill Leffler is joining us tonight to tell us a little bit about poetry. Merrill is a very distinguished poet. He's also the publisher of Dryad Press, a press which has been around for a number of years and has published many distinguished poets, including Pulitzer Prize winner James Wright. Merrill was originally a NASA engineer and then changed careers to pursue poetry. He subsequently taught at the University of Maryland and at the U.S. Naval Academy, and his books include Partly Pandemonium, Partly Love, Take Hold, and Mark the Music. He was also one of the founders of the Writers Center, if you're familiar with that Washington institution. We're delighted to have Merrill here tonight. Thank you, Merrill. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm on. Well, listen, first, thank you all for coming. And this started when Dorit said, "Can you give a talk for people who don't really like poetry or don't read poetry?" So I thought that was rather provocative. But the title was so you say you hate poetry. I added a little addendum to that. What's in it then for me? And I'm not sure, we'll see at the end of this, especially for those of you who have not read much poetry, if you find anything in it for you. But I thought it would be interesting and you will have this if you have the little handout that I put together. Richard Feynman, many of you may know of Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winning physicist, of course, and a great raconteur himself. But in the pleasure of finding things out, he wrote about poetry and talk about, if not hating, he said, when I was in high school, I was always worried about being a sissy. I didn't want to be too delicate. To me, no real man ever paid any attention to poetry and such things. How poetry ever got written struck me. So I developed a negative attitude toward the guys who studies French literature or studies too much musical poetry, all those fancy things. I think that's, whether it's a common attitude, I don't know. I know when I was in high school, especially, and even into college, I was often put off by poetry because I felt I wasn't getting the right answer. The way it was taught was, well, what does this mean? And I don't, these days there are a lot of poets going into schools, not right now, of course, and I think giving a different ways of entering poetry, not having to say what it means, what is the code here, can we break the code? I also have in here, as you'll see, a quote by Charles Darwin, which I've known for a very long time, from his autobiography. Up to the age of 30 or beyond it, poetry of many kinds gave me great pleasure. I have also said that pictures formerly gave me considerable joy and music every great delight. But now for many years, I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. But why this should have caused the atrophy of that part of the brain alone on which the higher tastes depend, I cannot conceive. If I had to live my life again, I would have made it a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps the part of my brain now atrophied would thus have been kept alive through use. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness. So Darwin wrote this in the 1860s. And then there's a quote here from T.S. Eliot, which I won't read right now. But what I did put in here, again, if you have how many do not have the handout? Can you raise your hand? Okay, we're going to be putting these up on the screen as well, so so you can see them, because it's often difficult to just hear if you're not used to listening to poetry. And even when you are, I've been to many poetry readings over these years, and the language sometimes can be so concentrated that it's difficult to really listen. So, Sasha, we have that small poem or excerpt of a poem by William Carlos Williams. It is difficult to get the news. Do you have that?
One moment, please. So this is the first one in your document, correct?
Yeah.
Thank you. I have the Williams Carl's the Greeny Flower. Is that what we're talking
Yeah,
about?
that's
Yes.
that one.
Thank you. One moment. Let me share my
Asphodel,
screen.
like greedy flower.
One moment. Here we go. Okay.
Okay. So this is a small piece of a very long poem that William Carlos Williams wrote late in life. In fact, he had had a stroke. He was a doctor. And I have several other poems of his in here. And there's a reason. One, he's been tremendously influential on modern poetry. He was a contemporary of T.S. Eliot and really disliked Eliot's poetry. He said that Eliot in The Wasteland sent us back to school, with all those classical references and so forth. But the reason I have this up here, because we're going to see this kind of technique in which the poem is not going back to the left-hand side. There are spaces in there, and every poem is orchestrated. Just like if you had a piece of music, you're looking at rest stops, you're looking at quarter stops, eighth stops. So line breaks, spaces, punctuation, they all mean, not when I say I mean, they are indicating to you, or an indication of how to read the poem. Now, I don't want to exaggerate, but you have these spaces there, and it's as if the mind is in motion. And here's a man who had a stroke also, by the way. And but you wouldn't even have to know that. So I'm just going to read it, and I'm going to use pauses here. Try not to exaggerate, because it's also the theme that I'm getting at, which relates to the couple of quotes we just read. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Let me read it again, okay? It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. So what is found there? What are we getting at? What is the poem? What are the poems getting at? Before we went on air, it occurred to me, and I really, I don't think I ever did this. I looked up the Merriam-Webster dictionary, of poetry. And what was the first definition of poetry? Writing that formulates a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience in language chosen and arranged to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, and rhythm. That's a heavy duty sentence. It could put you off from reading anything. So I use that to dispense with that. And again, I'm taking these lines out of context, but what is not in the news, what is not there, what is not in the news, and if you don't have a sense of poetry, as according to Williams, you're missing something. And we're going to come back to this way of spacing here, because you're going to see it in contemporary, modern poetry as well. And I think this is a great influence of Williams and of his contemporary Pound, but particularly Williams. There's another quote that I had here in this handout, which relates in some way by T.S. Eliot, that poetry is not to be defined by its uses. It may affect revolutions in sensibility. There may be ways of writing that affect our sensibility. And if any of you are familiar with The Wasteland, whether you've read it recently or not, it came at after this terrible, there's no adjective to describe World War I, but there was a sense of dislocation, despair. And that poem, the structure of The Wasteland, which I'm not going to get into, has that sense of despair in the way it's structured. It's not a linear structure. It's like a collage of different voices. But he writes, it may help to break up conventional modes of perception and valuation, which are perpetually forming, and make people see the world afresh. Poems, art, not just poetry, music, painting, theater, they make us see the world afresh or some new part of it. Poems may make us from time to time a little more aware of the deeper, unnamed feelings which form the substratum of our being, to which we rarely penetrate. And I think that's what Williams is getting at here. You know, if we don't have a sense of what the language is, what the language is capable of, what expression is, then according to these poets, and I'm among them, would say we're missing something. You know, for our lives are mostly, Eliot concludes in this quote, for our lives are mostly a constant evasion of ourselves and an evasion of the visible and sensible world. So what he's saying and what Williams are saying and what many poets are going to be saying is that we're trying to get at some core, I won't even call it truth, because truth is, you know, Nietzsche said a mobile army of metaphors. It's trying to get at something that we can't often express in, you know, in simple language. And sometimes you can do it in simple language. Maybe we can take this off. And I thought I would read a poem that that is at the beginning of the Mark the Music, because it reflects for me what, yeah, and I call it What I Want of It. Now, it's the first of two poems. At the end of this book, Mark the Music, there's another poem called What I Want of It, although I should probably have titled it What I Have of It. But this is more that romantic or that spiritual sense that poetry comes out of the sacred, out of that sense of, you know, deep desire. So, you know, in these lines, of course, I'm using hyperbole. You know, exaggeration is, you know, hyperbole is a not a euphemism, but it's a sense of reaching beyond ordinary language, or if not ordinary language, the way we would ordinarily express things. What I want of it, and this could relate to poetry. It could relate to life itself. I wanted to graze like gazelles and soar with the aplomb of hawks. I wanted to rise like a palace out of syllables of breath. I wanted to open locked gates with obscure incantations. I wanted to kick down locked doors and lead into meadows of starlight. I wanted to light up the night with meteors of radiance and desire. I wanted to inflame the coldness of my heart and set passion on fire. I wanted to waken the mountain gods and startle the dead from boredom. I wanted to revive my ancestors and ask for their blessings. I wanted to guide me through deserts year after year and lead me to water and wild fruit. I wanted to open my eyes and reveal angels ascending and descending in my own backyard. So, you know, this is, do I believe this literally if I'm speaking every day? It's trying to use the language to convey a feeling. Wordsworth spoke of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of emotions recollected in tranquility. Not every poet would agree with that by any means, but it's that sense of wanting something that evades us in our ordinary daily lives, that is a part of us. And I think, again, that's what Williams was getting at, to have that experience, to have that sensibility, to have that feeling. There's the end of a marvelous poem by Coleridge called Kubla Khan. And the ending is, weave a circle round him thrice, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. That sense of what poetry, what going deep into the language in which you are writing out of sometimes in a trance, not always, but some kind of trance. So what I've done here, this is kind of a prologue now. What I've done in this handout and in this, what we call the structure of this talk, it's not a lecture. So please, if you have questions or observations, I'm not the fount of knowledge, but please just write them down or raise your hand, however we're going to do that, Sasha. What I did, and this is a really big generalization, I've divided this talk or this handout into 4 different modes. I'll call them modes of poetry. As you'll see, there are 4. There really should be 5, but I'll explain what I mean in a moment. So just let me tell you what is coming ahead. There are poems that say what they mean, as I wrote, in subject and theme, and are generally wholly available. You don't have to think about them. Alexander Pope, the 18th century poet, said, about poetry, what oft was said, but ne'er so well expressed. These are poems that I'm putting in a category, but I really don't want to categorize them, that you don't have to analyze. You don't have to think, well, what does that mean? What is that poem getting at? Not a hidden meaning, not that the poet is trying to lead you, trying to trick you or keep you off guard. And then in the second section that I've called poems that say what they mean, yet sometimes are not as easy to summarize. They are elusive. They're using plain language, but they have a certain kind of elusiveness. Now, it's the third category, which I really should have divided, I think, into 2 parts. I've called them poems that are not imitative of everyday life, and we'll get to that, in which analogous may be, and only analogous in the poem that I just read to you, What I Want of It. It's not telling things directly, because it can't. It's not that the poet is trying to trick you or be superior or anything like that, but it's trying to find a language, a way of expressing something which he or she may not even know what it is, and is exploring it, is investigating it. And sometimes it's investigating the language itself. So so under those poems, as I'll say, there are poems that are surrealistic poems, poems of data poems, and you'll talk about that. But then there's also language poetry, and that's a name that I'll try to say something about that. And then the fourth one are just a few examples of concrete or pattern poetry. They're nonverbal, or sometimes they can be, but they are looking at the way words operate and how you break words down into their syllables. I mean, I only gave a few very small examples of that. So, okay, so we'll go back to the first part where I called it poems that say what they mean in subject and theme.
Can I intervene with a question?
What's that?
Can I intervene with a question?
Yes.
Your last category is a good one because those are New Yorker poems, largely. You go through your New Yorker and about 2/3 of them are not understandable, and another third really catch you. Would you say that?
Yeah, I don't know what percentage, but there will be poems that are not. But I want to get to that because I don't want to get too diverted. But when you're getting something new, when poets are, or any artist is investigating something, it's breaking through our conventional understanding often. I mean, if you think about abstract expressionism, when artists started going non-visual, non-mimetic, not imitating, or music, Stravinsky, who we've become, the Firebird and that music, which many of us love, and it's become part of the repertoire. He was booed when this music was first played. People walked out. So in many ways, how do we know if the artist is ahead of us, that we haven't caught up, or if it's just not any good?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be there, but it should be that the reader needs to understand whether or not what's going on, that this is a different mode of poem, and therefore be more tolerant or exploratory about it, rather than saying, I just don't look at them.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about that. In fact, how many of you saw Ron Charles's article in the Washington Post a few days ago? The title of the article was called, I didn't think I understood modern poetry. The less I tried to get it, the more I came to love it. And he goes on to explain, yeah, but I'll get that. I'll come back to Ron Charles because again, it's the we get used to certain certain modes, and we can become comfortable in them. But sometimes they can become, at least for for a writer or for an artist or for a composer, they get too comfortable, and you have to keep pushing those boundaries. At any rate, but let's start with this first category of that. Or again, I shouldn't call it a category, but mode of poems. And I have some very simple poems here. And I would like to look at, some of you may remember this, talk about a New Yorker poem. This is the old New Yorker. This is Dorothy Parker and Ogden Nash, who published greatly in the New Yorker many years ago in the 30s and in the 40s. And a very famous poem of Dorothy Parker's: razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live. Poem, it's interesting. The poem is called Resume. It's not called On Suicide or Reflections on Suicide, but it's Resume. What is a resume? A resume it represents you, right? I mean, it's your career. When you go out for a job, you have a resume or a CV. So is this Dorothy Parker? This is Dorothy Parker is the author, but she's created a character, a narrator, that may or may not be Dorothy Parker. This is not her reflection on life. I mean, it may be, but we don't know. There's a certain kind of play here, and through the rhyming, and they're damp, cramp. We have damp and cramp, and you. She doesn't rhyme that. Give and live, lawful and awful. This is one of those poems that you would find in the 1940s in the New Yorker. And it's pretty straightforward. There's not much to interpret. The same thing, I should say the same thing, but similarly with Ogden Nash. I didn't go to church today. I didn't go to church today. I trust the Lord to understand. The surf was swirling blue and white, the children swirling on the sand. He knows how brief my stay, how brief this spell of summer weather. He knows when I am said and done, we'll have plenty of time together. What about this poem? Is it opaque? Is it pretty understandable? Would you say it's understandable? I mean, he's playing I trust the Lord to understand. He knows how brief my stay, how brief the spell of summer weather. He knows when I am said and done, we'll have plenty of time together. Does Ogden Nash believe in an afterlife, that he's going to be with God or the Lord or whoever is waiting us? It's not a searching poem in the sense that he's questioning in any deep way. I think of Franz Kafka. In fact, I think I may have put that quote. I had another handout in there with some quotes from poets in which, I'm paraphrasing here now, Kafka said, we need work. Let me just see if I have it right here. Oh, I'm not sure where it is. He said, oh yeah, here it is. I mean, I could paraphrase it, but so here is Kafka. If the book we are reading does not wake us with a fist hammering on our skull, why then do we read it? So that it shall make us happy? Good God, we would also be happy if we had not books, and such books as make us happy we could, if need be, write ourselves. But what we must have are those books which come upon us like ill fortune and distress us deeply, like the death of one we love better than ourselves, like suicide. Now, Kafka, it feels a little bit strange pulling in Kafka here, But the poem by Ogden Nash, the poem by Dorothy Parker are not searching poems. They are telling us. Another poem, which is a poem I've known for many, many years, and it's called Incident by County Cullen. If we can put that up there. County Cullen, as you would know, is a Black poet, and I don't think a Black poet would be writing the theme of this poem in this way. But he was writing largely in the 30s, and he was quite young. He died at 43. But it comes out of an experience that he obviously had. Incident. Once riding in old Baltimore, heart filled, head filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger. And so I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. And here you have this poem of very simple rhymes, and it is just wrenching. It's a wrenching poem. And it's a poem that gives that expression that is very different, it seems to me, than the Ogden Nash and Dorothy Parker's poem. This is a memory poem, but it's written in a form that is a very simple form. And if we had had more time, I originally had about 25 other poems that, Dorrit said, that's too much. It's good. It's like, but a poem by Wanda Coleman, a Black poet who just died about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's a very tough poem. This poem gets you, at least it gets me, in its understatedness and in its simple rhymes. And again, but it's not a poem that you have to interpret. It's there for us without having to say, what does it mean? What is the poet getting at? He gives it to us straight on in a very simple and affecting language. Okay, so there are a couple of other poems here that I wanted to go to, well, two. One is, why don't we do, let's do the William Carlos Williams. I have 3 Williams poems, one that wasn't in the package. This is Just to Say, which is probably one of the most famous of his poems. The other one is The Red Wheelbarrow, and then another small poem, Between Walls. And I put these poems here purposely. It may be I'm emphasizing William Carlos Williams a lot because there are so many other poems to put in here. But it goes back to what we started with, the way that poem from the Asphodel, the Greeny Flower. Now, these poems were written earlier. This was before Williams had his stroke, and he was developing lines that were almost tracking his mind. But here, these are very thin lines. And what I've done, although I have a typo, I left out one of the words here. This is William Carlos Williams. This is Just to Stay. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, so cold. Now you say, well, why is that a poem? What makes this a poem? I said earlier that everything that the way a poem is presented to us on the page is scored. And by scoring, again, I mean the line breaks, the punctuation, the spacing. And here is a paragraph. This is the same thing, except I've left off the word, so I'll read it with words. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were so delicious, so sweet and so cold. And it's a sentence, and it's a very nice sentence, but what the lines do, it slows you down. They slow you down. They make you focus on the words themselves. And it's the sound. There are the S sounds in this poem. The plums and the saving and the breakfast and the delicious and the sweet, and the so cold. You can feel the juice of those plums in your mouth. But for Williams, everything, so much, we'll look at the Red Wheelbarrow, but it's using the line in a very, in a narrow, it's a narrow line. Before we look at Between Walls, Sasha, do you have the Red Wheelbarrow in front of you?
One moment, please. Was that in the packet of the?
I think I sent it to you earlier. Later.
Okay, one moment, please.
If you have it.
Let me just see if I have a search and find it. A Red Wheelbarrow?
Yes, Williams, the Red Wheelbarrow.
One moment, please. I don't think I have it
Okay,
handy.
Let me read it. How many of you know the Red Wheelbarrow? Anybody? Yeah, it's a very famous poem, and it's probably still in all the freshman or sophomore anthologies of poetry. So it's the Red Wheelbarrow, and again, it's a very narrow poem, and so I'm going to read it exaggeratingly with the line breaks. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Again, why is that a poem? I could put this in a prose line, but there are two things here. There's thematically, to begin with, and by slowing the language down, it makes us concentrate on each word. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Pay attention. Pay attention to where you are, what you see, what you hear. Last night, I listened to a podcast. It just occurs to me now to mention this, with Jay Perini. Jay Perini is a poet, a biographer, and he's written a book called Borges and Me. Okay, he had the great good fortune when he was quite young to have a teacher who was translating Borges, a man named Alastair Reid. And Perini was a student of Reid's, and they were in Scotland, and Borges, who was blind, was in Scotland. But Alastair Reid had to leave. We don't know why, but he had to leave. And he entrusted his student, Jay Perini, with taking Borges around. Now here's this, and Borges may have been 70 or so, 65, 70, and he was blind. And Perini was driving him around Scotland, and he said, "Oh, I want to see the Highlands. I really want to see the Highlands. You have to take me to see the Highlands." And Perini, a young man, said, "How can you see the Highlands? You're blind." And he said, "You're going to make me. You see them, and tell me what you see. Seeing is revelation." And it was that line that struck me, that seeing is revelation. And I thought of Williams here. And I thought of this poem. So you could say so much depends upon, the flower, the blooming hibiscus tree and this and then something else, but it's paying attention. It's a very Buddhist thing too, it seems to me. I don't mean thing, but of that sensibility of being aware. And so another famous quote from Williams, which could be misunderstood, I think, is no ideas but in things. Pay attention to where you are, what you see, what you hear. Everything means. And so another poem that I included in that handout, again, another thin little poem called Between Walls. Now you would pass an alley and you might see some junk there, or you might just see, well, here is Williams, Between Walls. The black wings of the hospital I'm sorry, the black wings of the hospital where nothing will grow lie cinders in which shine the broken pieces of a green bottle. Now, first of all, in reading this, the lines are not broken up in the way that you would expect, because he's forcing us to stop. The black wings of the hospital where nothing will grow lie cinders in which shine the broken pieces of a green bottle. Now, I'm reading and exaggerating. I'm exaggerating in the pauses, but again, the poem, the form of the poem, the spacing, the line breaks, the rhythms are what matters here. He's not, so when William says no ideas, but in things, it doesn't mean they didn't believe in ideas, but he is saying that the poem should be, for him, coming out of the phenomenal world, the world that we see. It doesn't mean that you don't think, that you don't reflect, but the reason that he opposed T.S. Eliot, who he was a contemporary of, coeval, was that Eliot was using lots of ideas in his poems. So more like top down, so to speak, ideas. I love a lot of Eliot's work, by the way.
Merrill, I'm coming off mute for 1 second to tell you that it's almost 7:40 and that we promised to leave people time for questions.
Okay, yeah, and I'm only on the first section, so I'm sorry about that. Let's go to the poems that say what they mean, yet sometimes are not easy to summarize. There are a couple of poems just to for me to read. One is "The Jewel" by James Wright. It's a short poem, and actually it's a poem that he translated from the Spanish poet Vallejo, but it's an interpretive translation. "The Jewel. There is this cave in the air behind my body that nobody is going to touch. A cloister, a silence, closing around a blossom of fire. When I stand upright in the wind, my bones turn to dark emeralds." Now, this is a poem speaking in metaphor, and he's calling it the jewel. It's not the self, it's the jewel. What is the jewel? And is there a real cave in the air behind my body? He's using imagery, he's using metaphor to try to evoke that sense of, it's hard to summarize, beauty, the beauty of the body, dark emeralds, emeralds we associate with green, I think. But there's also a cloister, a silence. This is where you're letting, you can try, we could go through and interpret this poem, or try to interpret this poem. But what, and I think of Ron Charles here, in which he said, I don't understand a lot of these poems, but I let the language wash over me. I just listen to it, because we can't read some of these poems and poems that you're going to see in this next section in the same way, just like you couldn't listen to Stravinsky in the same way that you listen to Beethoven, just like you couldn't look at Jackson Pollock in the same way that you looked at his great influence or mentor, Thomas Hart Benton. We often don't have the language to, we have to suspend our disbelief, to draw on Coleridge, who said this in another way, to just listen. And there may be images that stick out with you. You don't have to have a poem that has a beginning, middle, and end. That it may be made up of fragments. The poem that I began with, "What I Want of It," is made up of a lot of different lines, different pieces, and you hope that they cohere into some sensibility, some not even necessarily paraphrasable, or the paraphrase is only a shadow of what the poem is. Because if you could say that's what the poem would be. The poet is, or an artist is working at trying to understand something that they don't know. This would be a good time. I would just call on. One of the quotes that I handed out to you was by Anne Carson, and this I think gets at what I'm talking about, and especially in the next section. A poem, when it works, is an action of the mind captured on a page. It's the mind in action. Jackson Pollock was he's called an action painter. It was, I don't want to make direct parallels, but it's that sense that you're in the process. So a poem, when it works, is an action of the mind captured on a page. And readers, when they engage it, have to enter into the action. Not saying, what do I want out of this poem? What do I expect this poem to do? The mind repeats that action and travels through it, but it is a movement of yourself through a thought, through an activity of thinking. So by the time you get to the end, you're different than you were at the beginning, and you feel that difference. So, you could read the poem The Jewel by James Wright today and get some feeling coming out of maybe one or two of those images. You could read it 2 days from now and something else will strike you. It's entering into those lines. This is not something a lot of us are comfortable with, because we're often looking for answers. What does this mean? We're looking for cause and effect. And often artists are working against that, especially contemporary artists. They're looking for surprise, expectations, or what they didn't know. You're really interested in what you don't know rather than what you do know. This may be a time. Okay, how are we doing on time? Let me just see. 7:45. Okay.
Yeah, I want to kind of leave them the last 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, let's do this. I want to go to that section 3 that I called Poems Not Imitative Everyday Life. I have in here a short poem by Vicente I'm pronouncing his name wrong, Wheelbarrow, and it's called Manifesto, perhaps. And I'm using this as a kind of preface for the one kind of poems that are not imitative of life as it is. You must not look through these poems for a memory of things seen, nor the possibility of seeing other things. A poem is a poem, just as an orange is an orange. You will not find things that already existed, nor come into direct contact with objects of the external world. Poets will no longer imitate nature, for they don't allow themselves to plagiarize God. You will find what you've never seen before, the poem, a human creation. Now, that human creation, we may not understand necessarily. We might have glimpses into it, but we always have expectation, especially because of our schooling, that we have to explain everything. And sometimes art just washes over you. You get a sense of it, depending on how much you bring to it. And in poems like a couple of these, these poems that I put on this page, it's difficult to summarize in any easy way. But again, I think of Ron Charles, and I loved what he had to say about letting the language wash over you. So, for example, let's take A Little Closer to the Edge by Ocean Vuong. I've spelled his name incorrectly, haven't I, Sasha? Is it Vounge? Okay, so A Little Closer to the Edge. Yeah, I want to read this poem. Okay, Ocean Vuong, who's a young man, born 1988. It goes like this. young enough to believe nothing will change. No, I'm sorry. Young enough to believe nothing will change them. They step hand in hand into the bomb crater. The night full of black teeth. His faux Rolex, weeks from shattering against her cheek, now dims like a miniature moon behind her hair. In this version, the snake is headless, stilled like a cord unraveled from the lover's ankles. He lifts her white cotton skirt, revealing another hour. His hands, the syllables inside them. Oh, Father, oh, foreshadow, press into her as the field shreds itself with cricket cries. Show me how ruin makes a home out of hip bones. Oh, Mother, oh, minute hand, teach me how to hold a man the way thirst holds water. Let every river envy our mouths. Let every kiss hit the body like a season. Where apples thunder, the earth with red hooves, and I am your son. Now this is if I say complex poem, it's a poem full of images. If you look at this poem, in fact, I didn't do it on the screen, but there's so many unknowns here. Who is the speaker? Who is the he? Is it the father, perhaps? We have the address to the mother. But we're getting some sense of a narrator here by the nature of the images that he's using. They're not, and they're not always understandable. Or why this? His faux Rolex, weeks from shattering against the cheek, now dims like a miniature moon behind her hair. What the hell is a miniature moon behind her hair? It's provocative. We can reject it out of hand, or we can say, oh, what I found in this young man's poems are provocation of images, of feelings that I just get a sense of that I can't summarize very easily, but I'm so struck by the images and that intensity. Oh, Father, oh, foreshadow, press into her. Who is the her? It's as if he's trying to discover himself, as if the poem, not him, the poem is trying to discover what it's about itself. Now, I'm going to take one last thing here. A number of years ago, I undertook to review a book by a language poet, a poet who was not writing in any linear way, and I just didn't get it. But I kept on reading, and I'm going to read you, and in the review, I couldn't find the words to say it, so I started thinking about what is this poet doing, trying to get inside the mind of the poet. And I came up, and so I was writing for myself, thinking about the old way, the normal way, I shouldn't say the old, yeah, I'm calling it the old way, the ordinary way of speaking, and the new. And it goes like this. There's the old sentence, so I'm calling it the old sentence, and then the new sentence. So the old sentence, so it said, is a long freight train hauling syntactic units across the plains, getting the old goods from one place to another. Dependable as the sun's apparent rise gives us morning, and its apparent descent gives us night. All well and good. God's in his heaven, etc. Commerce of all kinds depends on the old sentence. You have a purchase order, a bill of lading, you can track its shipping and know its expected time of arrival. You may be satisfied or not, still the old sentence got the job done. All hail the old sentence. And the old sentence being those things that we well understand. Now the new sentence. Dependable as you choose the weather, subprimes, Al-Qaeda, Congress, taxes, young love. The new sentence falls upward and anywhere. And the goods, the new goods, the goods of data, of the I have a little footnote there. And the goods, the new goods come dropping like parachutes out of the sky, landing in a line, perhaps not. The meaning? A wild surmise. Who knows what happens next? John Cage? Charles Ives? Whoops, sunrise, surprise. So, I mean, I know it's tough to get a poem that you don't see in front of you when you're hearing it, but the thing is that in a lot of the poems, and the poems going back to Michael in the New Yorker, are not poems that we often can read in the same way that we're reading Dorothy Parker or Ogden Nash or even County Cullen or Robert Frost. And so you could say, well, this is kind of elitist poetry. You know, it's for the cognoscenti, the people who are really into poetry. And I don't want to be a sissy, as Jane, as Feynman said. But it's not. I think that it's a lot of poetry that I don't that I try to move with, because I find some very exciting images. And so it's not like being in school where you have to answer the question, well, what is this all about? Is there anything that attracts you? Is there anything that provokes you? Not necessarily the whole poem, but some lines or something that catches you unexpected. It's the unexpected that I think most, I can't speak for most artists, but I think that artists of any kind want the discovery for themselves. If no discovery for you, there's no discovery for anybody else. I realize that I've gone on, Dart. I see you getting nervous there. So where do we go on? If there are questions?
No, I really appreciate it. That was the perfect image for ending, that, we expect a freight train and we expect it to go somewhere. And that's not what the newer poems are trying to do. But rather than me talk, I think I should let all the people who came to hear you ask their questions if they want to come off mute.
Are we asking if anybody has questions?
Yeah. Does anyone? I'm trying to see them.
No?
So there's no one in chat asking a question. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, now's a great time to do it. Thank you.
I don't know if I have a question, but I have a comment.
Good.
One of the things that is wonderful to me about poetry is that many different poems have extra dimensions. And if I can just go through a couple of examples of the things we just went through, the poem about the plums by Williams, it also talks about a relationship between the writer and the person who put the plums in the fridge. And he doesn't talk about the relationship.
That's right.
The relationship is incredibly important in the background. Ogden Nash's poem, I Didn't Go to Church Today. Yes, he did go to church because he went out into creation.
Right.
And so, you see, and the element of surprise that catches you in the wheelbarrow, there is always something extra that's not in the poem, but that also pulls you in.
In the plum poem, there's a series on PBS. I can't think of her name. It's a Harvard professor who has conversations about particular poems. And this season, and she'll have 4 or 5 different people, couples in some cases, who are listening to the poem. This is just to say that I've taken the plums, I've beaten the plums, was the subject of one of the broadcasts. And it was amazing to me because I hadn't really thought about this in this way, about the different ways you can read that poem in terms of what's not, as you just said, what's not said, and how is the tone. What is it being playful? Is it sarcastic? Is it, there are different ways of reading that poem. And it leaves things open rather than closed. We have closed forms and we have open forms. And what that what it requires is us to participate in the making, in a sense, the making of what that poem is. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland must have 50 books about the wasteland. There've got to be at least 50, let alone the hundreds of interpretations. Eliot went off and wrote that poem when he was, as he said, this was after World War I. and he was feeling miserable and depressed. But it didn't mean that it wasn't literary. But there were meanings that people have taken out of that poem that it wouldn't have occurred to Eliot at all, and didn't. So.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions? Sealed? Sealed? Unmute yourself, please. One
You
moment.
want to help her, Sasha?
Yeah,
There
I'm
you
going to
go.
send her a little.
I
Wonderful.
think I did.
There you go.
I was just wondering, sir, do you feel that brief poems, very brief poems, can be more pithy and more interpretive than rather long, verbose, chatterings that go on and on, of mutterings of sounds?
Well, it's a little pejorative about going on.
Well,
But yes. Well, listen, a form that is, and I didn't have any examples here, but the haiku, which many poets are engaged in, and they're really concentrated in such a way that tremendously tremendously evocative, sure, and often have that kind of simplicity that Williams's poems, The Red Wheelbarrow, everything depends, and those haiku are very focused, and often not in any linear way necessarily, but by associationally, the associations that are made.
Yes.
I mean, that's generalizing. I really need to have some poems here to talk about that. But yes, there's a line by Robert Frost that his aim was to lodge a poem in the memory, in your memory, that you will know that poem. And how does that come about? It comes about in different ways, through rhythm, images. I mean, it's hard to say. I'll give you a poem that just occurs to me as we're speaking, and it's a translation of an Irish poem from the Gaelic, an 18th century poet.
Mm-hmm.
I am Raftery, the poet, full of hope and love, my eyes without sight, my mind without torment, going west on my journey by the light of my heart. Behold me now, my back to the wall, singing my song to empty pockets. God, that poem is lodged in my mind for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And even with my disappearing memory, it's still there. I was happy to say. And often, we have poems serve different service in different ways. I can think of long poems that I, relatively long poems, like 60, 70 lines, that I've memorized because of their music. I think of Tennyson's Ulysses, for example. But anyway, are there other questions or observations or comments?
Translations are changing the sound so much. If I read Neruda or Rumi in English, I really read the translator, Coleman Hawkins, is that his name? Anyway, the Rumi translator.
Coleman Barks on Rumi.
I'm going to hop in for 2 seconds here. That's why translators get a separate copyright, because it is truly a new work.
Well, sure it is. In fact, it's how many of you, I pulled out Neruda here because I thought it would be great to read. And again, this is in English, but Neruda if you don't know Neruda's, in Spanish, it's Odes Elementales, my poor Spanish accent, elemental odes. And he has ode to his trousers, ode to a tomato, ode to a book, ode to salt. And, let me just give you, this is in English. And again, these are sometimes just one word on a line. And what it does is, it forces you to slow down. Ode to the tomato. The street drowns in tomatoes. Noon, summer, light breaks in 2 tomato halves, and the streets run with juice. In December, the tomato cuts loose, invades kitchens, takes over lunches, settles at rest on sideboards with the glasses, butter dishes, blue salt cellars. It has its own radiance, a goodly majesty. Too bad we must assassinate. A knife plunges into its living pulp, and it continues to go on. But this is this kind of improvisation, and that's what, you love that, to just improvise and see what happens. Again, it's surprising you, it's trying to surprise yourself. We're not talking about good poetry or bad poetry. It's just trying to break through our ordinary ways of thinking and conceptualizing. So.
I'm going to be an evil person and cut in one more time because I know Michael Whalen wants to say something before people start bopping off of the Zoom.
Okay.
Michael is our literary committee chair. Unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you. This was really delightful. It's what we had hoped for, that to create the questions and deal with questions of people in the back of their head. Also, we have in mind the idea that this is just the beginning of a conversation. Clearly, we could have gone on for hours tonight, but I'm thinking of, we're trying to do new things in the literary committee, and this is, how about an arts club poetry forum? This is not for poets or non-poets. It's for anybody who is curious or interested or likes poetry. That's what we're thinking of. And it'll be a monthly meeting, initially online. When the pandemic is over, we might meet in person to share the interest of what's happening in the world of poetry. It may be to talk about what's going on in poetry. It may be to talk about an individual poem. It may be for somebody to read poems, but a lot of it would come out of the idea, we would shape it by the people who get together. So we want to find out if there's a demand for that, if there's somebody who would like to do that. And we're going to open this up, especially during the pandemic, to non-members as well as members. We want to welcome people in. So if you like the idea and would like to get involved and say, well, I got a thought of it, either I'll help with it or I just like to give the idea, we'll probably plan an event like a Zoom where people can get together and talk. So to do that, would you contact the literary committee? And basically me, here's my phone, my email address there, whalengroup@rcn.com, and RCN stands for Roman Catholic Nun, of course. But and so anyway, please keep that in mind. We'd be delighted if we get enough people saying we're interested, we'll move on this. Okay. And thank you again.
Thank you, Michael.
Really marvelous presentation.
And I'll put your email in the chat function, so if you want to pick up your email.
If you want to
you
be in
can
touch, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, Merrill. That was just what we needed. I wish we would have had twice the time. We usually record for 1 hour, so.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, well,
Thank you. And thank you for everyone who joined us.
Yes, we had a big crowd, about 25 people or so. That's great.
So as we like to say, that's a wrap, folks. Thanks for coming out today. And if you just give me one big old wave. So just want to say, everybody, have a great holiday season. Happy Hanukkah for our Jewish friends celebrating this evening. And Merry Christmas as we go further on, and Happy New Year if we don't see you before then. So thanks again. And from Dorrit, myself, and Merrill, on behalf of the Arts Club, thank you for coming out, and we really enjoyed having you. Have a great night.